An old woman saved by a veteran and his dog. But God had a far greater gift waiting. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a cold winter night in a small town tucked away in the heart of the Midwest. The wind howled through the trees, biting and unforgiving, carrying with it the weight of an impending storm. The streets were eerily quiet, except for the soft crunch of snow under the boots of a lone figure making his way through the darkness. His name was Jack Miller, a man who had seen more than a share of pain and loss in his lifetime. A former soldier, now a drifter, Jack had been living on the streets for months. His days were spent searching for shelter, food, and some semblance of peace. But most of the time, all he found was loneliness and despair. But through it all, he had one faithful companion by his side. His dog, Max. Max was a large, rugged German shepherd, loyal and steadfast. Together, they had weathered the storms of life, never asking for more than the basics: a roof over their heads, a warm meal, and each other's company. That night, as Jack trudged through the snow, Max stayed close to his side, his ears perked, sensing something Jack couldn't yet see. It was the kind of night when the world seemed to close in around you, but Max seemed to know something Jack didn't. They made their way through the small town, the only signs of life the faint glow of streetlights and the occasional passing car. They approached a small, run-down house at the edge of town. Jack had passed by this house many times before, but had never given it much thought. It was just another abandoned building, another broken structure that no one cared about. But tonight, something was different. Max suddenly stopped and barked, pulling Jack toward the door. Jack hesitated. For a moment, unsure of why they were stopping, but the look in Max's eyes was enough to make him follow. He knocked softly on the door, unsure if anyone would be home. To his surprise, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman standing inside. She looked frail, her face weathered with age, but there was a warmth in her eyes that immediately put Jack at ease. She smiled kindly at him. "You look like you could use some help," she said in a voice that was soft but strong. Jack nodded, grateful for the invitation. "I'm sorry to bother you," he began, "but my dog and I are just looking for a place to rest for the night." The woman stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. "Of course," she said. "Come in, both of you. It's not much, but it's warm." Jack stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. The house was small but cozy. The scent of homemade bread and stew filled the air, making his stomach growl. Max patted him behind him, sniffing the room with curiosity. As Jack sat down by the fire, the woman introduced herself as Edith. She was a widow, living alone after the death of her husband many years ago. They exchanged small talk as Jack gratefully accepted a bowl of stew. As the night wore on, Jack began to feel a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. But what Jack didn't know, what neither he nor Edith could have ever expected, was that this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change both of their lives forever. Max, ever the vigilant companion, had sensed something long before Jack had, and that night, he had led them not just to a warm meal, but to something far greater. As Jack sat by the fire, his body slowly unwinding from the tension of the cold night air, he couldn't help but notice how different it felt to be inside a home again. It had been months since he had slept under a roof that wasn't temporary or borrowed. Edith, the elderly woman who had opened her door to them, was now sitting across from him, stirring a pot of stew. Max, ever watchful, lay at Jack's feet, eyes closed, yet his body seemed attuned to every sound. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the room with warmth, the kind of warmth that seemed to seep into Jack's bones, easing the ache he had carried for so long. Edith looked up from her cooking, her weathered face softening as she spoke. "I don't get many visitors these days. It's nice to have someone here, even if just for a little while." Jack smiled faintly, grateful for her company. "Thank you for letting us stay," he said. "You didn't have to. We weren't expecting. No need to thank me, dear. I don't mind at all. I've lived here for so long by myself. It gets lonely, you know." She paused, her eyes growing distant for a moment, lost in thought. Jack, sensing a story behind her words, stayed quiet, giving her the space to share what she wanted. Edith's voice broke the silence again, this time with a gentle smile. I was married once. A long time ago. My husband, George, and I built this place together. He was a carpenter, and we worked side by side for many years, making this house a home. We had a good life, but then, after he passed, it was just me. And Max, of course. She patted the dog's head affectionately. Jack nodded. He could see the sorrow in her eyes, the kind that never really goes away, even after years. The loss of someone you loved deeply. He could relate to that pain in ways that still haunted him. It's not much, Edith continued, her voice growing softer. But this house holds memories. It holds a part of him. And for me, that's enough. I'm content, as long as I can keep going. Jack felt a wave of empathy wash over him. He understood the need to hold on to the past, to preserve the memories of lost loved ones, especially when everything else felt so uncertain. You've done a good job here, Jack said. It's warm. It feels like a place where people are cared for. Edith smiled at the compliment, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that Jack couldn't quite place. She seemed to be hiding something, a secret tucked away behind the kind facade she wore. As the evening wore on, the storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling through the trees, but inside, the house remained a sanctuary of warmth. Max had settled down, his tail wagging lazily as he drifted into a deep sleep. Edith seemed content, too, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment as she sat back in her chair. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of peace in the quiet company. But just as he thought the night would end in peaceful silence, Max suddenly lifted his head, his ears pricked and his body stiffening. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. Max growled low in his throat, his amber eyes narrowing as he focused on something unseen. Edith stirred, her gaze following Jack's. "What is it, Max?" she asked, a slight edge of worry in her voice. Jack slowly stood up, his hand resting on Max's back. "I'm not sure. He senses something." Max's growl grew louder, more insistent, and his body was tense, ready to spring into action. Jack moved toward the window, his eyes scanning the darkened yard outside. Through the rain-soaked glass, he saw nothing but shadows dancing in the wind. Yet, something told him that Max had picked up on something he couldn't see or hear. Edith joined him at the window, her brow furrowed. "It's not safe to go outside in this storm," she said, concern in her voice. Jack nodded but didn't move. He was too distracted by the strange sense of unease that had settled over him. Max's instincts had always been right before. He trusted the dog's senses more than his own. After a long moment, the growl stopped, and Max relaxed, but his gaze remained fixed on the shadows outside. "What do you think it is?" Edith asked quietly. Jack hesitated, his mind racing. He had no explanation, but he knew deep down that something was out there. Something that was calling to them. Just as he was about to speak, there was a knock at the door. A sharp, rapid knock that broke the silence of the house. Both Jack and Edith froze. "Who could that be?" Edith whispered, her voice shaky. Jack moved quickly toward the door, his heart pounding. He reached for the handle, hesitating just for a moment before pulling it open. What he saw next sent a chill down his spine. The door creaked open slowly, and Jack's heart raced as he peered into the darkness outside. The storm outside raged on, but standing at the threshold was an unexpected figure. A man, disheveled and soaked to the bone, stood in the doorway, clutching a small bundle wrapped in a weathered cloth. His eyes were wide with fear, and he seemed to be struggling to stay on his feet. Jack instinctively stepped forward, his hand reaching for the man to steady him. "Are you all right?" Jack asked, his voice low but urgent. The man nodded weakly, shivering from the cold. I need help," he managed to say, his voice hoarse and strained. Edith, standing behind Jack, gasped softly when she saw the man. "Mason," she whispered. The man's eyes flickered with recognition as he looked at Edith, but it was clear that he had no strength left. His eyes darted back to Jack, pleading silently for help. Jack, without thinking, pulled the man inside, helping him across the threshold. "What happened to you?" Edith asked as she quickly moved to help the man remove his drenched coat. The man's face was pale, his lips trembling, but he seemed relieved to be in the warmth. "I was on my way to the old cabin," he began, his voice shaky. But the storm. I got lost. There's something out there, something in the woods. I couldn't find my way. Jack furrowed his brow, glancing at Edith. What is he talking about? Edith looked uneasy, her gaze flickering toward the window, as if something beyond it had caught her attention. Mason was once a neighbor of mine, she explained quietly. He lived just outside of town, in the old cabin by the creek. But he disappeared years ago. No one ever knew what happened to him. Jack's mind raced. Mason's sudden appearance in the middle of the storm was odd enough, but the mention of the old cabin and the woods made him uneasy. What did you see out there? Jack asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. Mason hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the room nervously. I don't know exactly, he said, his voice trembling. But there's something in those woods. Something watching me. Edith frowned, a concerned look crossing her face. It's just the storm, she said softly, trying to calm Mason. There's nothing out there but the wind and the trees. But Mason shook his head vigorously, his eyes wide with fear. No, you don't understand, he insisted. It wasn't the wind. It was something watching me, moving just beyond the trees. I could hear it, and then the ground started to shake, like something was coming. I had to run. I don't know how long I've been running. Jack exchanged a look with Edith. It was clear that Mason wasn't making up the story. His fear was real, and it seemed to have a deep hold on him. Jack took a deep breath and glanced toward the window again. The storm was still fierce, but the woods outside were dark and silent. What do you think it is? Jack asked Edith, his voice low. Edith bit her lip, her eyes filled with concern. There's always been talk of strange things in those woods, she said quietly. Old legends about things that go bump in the night. But no one ever took them seriously. I never believed them, not until now. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The night had taken an unsettling turn. Mason's appearance, the storm, and the mention of something in the woods. It all felt too strange to be a coincidence. You should stay here for the night, Jack said, his voice firm. The storm's too bad, and you're in no condition to be outside. Mason nodded weakly, still looking out the window, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. I don't think I can stay in that cabin anymore, he whispered. Not after what I saw. Edith placed a comforting hand on Mason's shoulder, her eyes full of compassion. You're safe here, Mason, she said gently. The storm will pass, and in the morning, we'll figure out what's going on. But Jack knew there was something more to this. He wasn't sure what Mason had seen, but something about the woods felt off. He turned back to the window, staring into the blackness, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against him. Max, who had been lying quietly by the fire, suddenly stood up, his body tense, ears pricked. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he followed Max's gaze. Through the window, just past the trees, a faint light flickered, as though something, or someone, was moving through the woods. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the light grew brighter, coming closer, and then just as quickly, it disappeared. What was that? Jack whispered, his pulse quickening. Edith, who had been watching him closely, stepped beside him, her eyes wide with fear. What is it, Jack? She asked, her voice barely audible. I don't know. Jack replied, his voice steady despite the unease building inside him. But I think it's time we find out. The storm outside had only grown fiercer, the wind howling like a wild animal, battering the house with relentless force. Jack stood by the window, watching the flickering light that had appeared in the woods. It had disappeared just as quickly as it came, but now the air in the room felt thick with tension. Max was still alert, his ears pricked, his body rigid, eyes scanning the darkness outside. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. What was that light? What had Mason seen in the woods? Mason, who had been sitting near the fire, suddenly stirred. I've never seen anything like it, he muttered, his voice still shaky. Jack turned toward him, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? Mason swallowed hard, as if the words he was about to say were heavy with fear. It wasn't just the storm. There's something else out there, something unnatural. Edith, who had been silent for a while, now spoke up. Mason, you're just rattled. The storm's got you on edge. But Jack wasn't so sure. Something about the way Mason spoke, the fear in his eyes, felt too real. He could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on them, and it made his skin crawl. What exactly did you see out there? Jack asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Mason hesitated, glancing nervously at the door, as if expecting something to come barging in. "I don't know how to explain it," he said slowly. But there was a light, like it was moving through the trees. It wasn't a car or anything like that. It was too bright, too steady, like it had a purpose. And then, the ground started to shake beneath me. I swear, something was coming. Edith frowned, clearly trying to make sense of what Mason was saying, but Jack wasn't so quick to dismiss it. "The ground shook?" Jack repeated, his mind racing with possibilities. "Like an earthquake?" Mason nodded, his eyes wide. "Yes, but not like any earthquake I've ever felt. It was different, almost like something was burrowing its way through the earth." Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm the growing unease inside him. "Maybe we should go out and check," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Edith shook her head quickly. "Jack, no. It's too dangerous out there. We don't know what we're dealing with." Jack met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "We have to know. Whatever's out there, it's not just a coincidence. We need answers." Edith's face softened, but she didn't argue further. She knew Jack well enough to understand that once his mind was set, there was no changing it. She moved toward the door, grabbing a worn coat off the hook. "If you're going, I'm coming with you," she said, her voice calm but resolute. Jack paused, glancing at her. "Are you sure? It's not safe." "I'm not letting you go alone," Edith replied, her eyes steady. Max, who had been lying quietly by the fire, suddenly rose to his feet, tail straight, eyes focused. He padded over to the door and scratched at it, as if urging them to hurry. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Max had been unusually tense all night, and now the dog was practically demanding to go outside. Something was out there. "All right," Jack said, pulling on his coat. "But we stay together, and we stick to the trail. No matter what we find, we don't split up." Edith nodded, slipping on her boots. The three of them made their way to the door, Max leading the way, his senses sharp. As Jack opened the door, the full force of the storm hit them. The wind screamed through the trees, and the snow whipped against their faces. Jack stepped outside, followed by Edith and Max, and immediately felt the cold seep into his bones. The night had fallen completely, and the woods beyond were cloaked in an eerie silence. Max, however, was undeterred. The dog darted ahead, sniffing the ground, his movements quick and purposeful. Jack and Edith followed close behind, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the deep snow. They moved cautiously, eyes scanning the dark woods for any sign of movement. As they ventured further into the forest, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional growl of wind through the trees. Max suddenly stopped, his body stiff, and his head raised high. He barked once, a sharp, alert sound that sent a jolt through Jack's body. Jack held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. There, in the distance, just beyond the trees, Jack saw it. A flickering light. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but as he looked closer, he realized it was moving, slowly but steadily, through the woods. "Do you see that?" Jack whispered to Edith, his voice tight with disbelief. Edith nodded, her face pale in the glow of the light. "I see it," she said, her voice barely audible. Max growled low in his throat, a warning sound that only made the tension in the air thicker. Jack stepped forward, but as he did, the light stopped. It hovered for a moment, then began to move again, this time faster, as though it had sensed them. Jack's pulse quickened. "We need to follow it," he said, his voice steady with purpose. Edith hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Be careful, Jack." They moved forward, carefully following the light through the dense trees, Max leading the way. As they drew closer, the light grew brighter, its flickering becoming more intense. It was almost as if the light was alive, reacting to their presence. Just as they were about to reach the clearing where the light had stopped, it suddenly vanished. The forest fell silent, the only sound the howling wind. Jack and Edith exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever had been out there, it was gone now, but Jack knew in his gut that this was just the beginning. The silence in the woods was deafening. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint rustling of the trees as Jack, Edith, and Max stood in the clearing where the mysterious light had disappeared. They all stared into the darkness, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on them. Max's ears were still pricked, his body tense, his eyes searching the shadows. Jack's heart was racing. He could feel it, deep in his bones, that something was wrong. The light had been too strange, too purposeful. And now, its sudden disappearance only left more questions than answers. What now? Edith whispered, her voice tight with unease. Jack's gaze shifted to the thick forest ahead, where the shadows seemed to move and shift with an eerie rhythm. We keep moving, Jack said, his voice low but resolute. We need to find out what's going on. There's something out here, and I'm not leaving until we figure it out. Edith hesitated for a moment, looking back toward the house, but then nodded. She knew Jack well enough to understand that once his mind was set, there was no changing it. Max, as if sensing the direction of their next move, turned and began trotting toward the trees. Stay close, Jack warned, his eyes scanning the forest. The three of them followed Max, who seemed to know exactly where to go. The forest grew darker as they moved deeper, the only light coming from the faint glow of the stars above. It was cold now, much colder than it had been earlier, and the air felt heavy, thick with tension. Jack's thoughts raced as they moved through the woods. What had Mason seen? What had caused the strange light? And why did it seem so intent on leading them deeper into the forest? His questions were interrupted by Max's sudden bark. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The dog was growling low, his body tense as he stood still, looking ahead. Jack, Edith, and Max stopped in their tracks. Jack's pulse quickened as he followed Max's gaze. At first, all he could see was darkness, but then, in the distance, he noticed a faint glow. It was back, the light, flickering just like before. But this time, it was different. It was larger, brighter, and seemed to be coming toward them. What the hell is that? Edith asked, her voice shaking. Jack didn't answer at first. He couldn't. The light was too strange, too inexplicable. It moved through the trees, its glow growing stronger. And then, suddenly, there was no light at all. The darkness was complete. It's gone again, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. What the hell is going on here? We need to go back, Edith urged, her eyes wide with fear. This is insane. Whatever it is, it's not worth risking our lives. But Jack wasn't listening. His mind was focused on one thing, the light. He had to know what it was. He had to understand. Without saying another word, he moved forward, deeper into the woods. Edith's voice trembled as she called after him. Jack, wait. Don't go. But Jack didn't stop. He couldn't. Something inside him told him that the answers were just ahead, waiting for him. The light had to mean something. As he walked, the silence was almost unbearable. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, the air thick with anticipation. Max was still ahead, leading the way, his body low to the ground as he sniffed the air. The strange glow returned, this time directly ahead of them. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The light was getting closer, and he could now see that it wasn't just a glow. There was movement, something shifting in the shadows. Jack's heart raced as he stepped closer, his instincts screaming at him to stop. But he couldn't. He was too close now. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light stopped. Jack froze. His mind raced. What was it? What was this thing they had been chasing? The light flickered one last time, and then vanished entirely. The air was still. Too still. Jack stood in the silence, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Max was now at his side, sniffing the ground as if trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Edith caught up with them, panting. Jack, we need to go back. Now. But Jack didn't move. He was staring at the spot where the light had been, his mind spinning. Something was buried here. Something important. He turned to Edith, his voice quiet but firm. We're not leaving until we find out what's going on. I know it's here. Edith opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She could see it in Jack's eyes. He was determined. And no matter how much she wanted to go back, she knew there was no convincing him now. All right, she said quietly, but we need to be careful. Whatever this is, it's not just a coincidence. Jack nodded, his gaze shifting toward the trees ahead. I know, but we're going to figure this out. Together, they moved deeper into the woods, following Max, who seemed more determined than ever to lead them on. As they ventured farther, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. Jack's breath formed visible clouds in the air as they trudged forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. Max led them to a clearing, and there, in the middle of it, was an old stone structure. It was covered in moss and ivy, its once grand stone walls now crumbling and forgotten. The light, whatever it was, had brought them here. Jack's pulse quickened as he stepped closer, reaching out to touch the cold stone. There was something hidden here, something that had been waiting for them. The answer was near, but what it would be, Jack wasn't sure. He only knew that this was the beginning of something far greater than they could have ever imagined. As Jack approached the ancient stone structure, a chill ran down his spine. The air grew colder the closer he got, and the once faint hum of energy from the mysterious light seemed to intensify. Max, always ahead, sniffed at the base of the stone, his growl low but steady, his body stiff with an unease Jack had never seen before. Edith, who had been walking behind, caught up to them and looked at the structure with wide eyes. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice a mix of awe and fear. Jack paused for a moment, taking in the sight of the overgrown stone walls, their surface cracked with age but still standing firm. The structure seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in the woods. It had an ancient, almost sacred feel to it, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it, just as Jack and Edith had. The stone walls were covered in moss and vines, but through the cracks, Jack could make out strange markings, symbols carved into the stone, worn by time, but still legible. "I don't know," Jack replied, his voice low, "but we need to find out." He stepped closer, reaching out to touch the stone. As his fingers brushed against the cool surface, a sudden vibration ran through the ground beneath him. Max barked sharply, his body rigid, and Edith stumbled back in surprise. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack didn't answer. He was too focused on the sensation beneath his feet, the way the ground seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't explain. Then, without warning, the stone in front of him shifted. The ground rumbled, and Jack stepped back just in time as a section of the stone wall slowly slid open, revealing a dark passageway leading deep underground. "What the hell?" Jack whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Edith stepped forward, her eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. "Is it safe?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, torn between the urge to turn back and the overwhelming need to know what was hidden beneath the earth. The light, the strange vibrations, the stone structure, it all pointed to something far greater than he could have imagined. "We have to go down there," Jack finally said, his voice steady. Edith hesitated for only a moment before nodding, her resolve hardening. "All right," she said, her tone resigned but determined. "But we stick together, no matter what." Jack nodded, and they both turned to Max, who stood at the entrance of the passageway, sniffing the air with his usual alertness. His growl was low but insistent, as though he was trying to warn them. Jack crouched down beside him. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. Max looked back at him, his amber eyes glowing with unease. He barked once, then slowly walked into the passageway, as if urging Jack and Edith to follow. With a final glance at Edith, Jack stepped into the dark passage, followed closely by her and Max. The air inside the tunnel was cool and damp, and the scent of earth and stone filled their nostrils. The walls of the passage were lined with the same ancient stone, but now the markings were clearer, more intricate. Jack could make out symbols that seemed almost alive, shifting subtly in the flickering light from their flashlights. "This doesn't feel right," Edith said, her voice tight with apprehension. "It feels like we're walking into something ancient." Jack didn't disagree. He could feel it too, that strange pull, that sense that they were venturing into something that had been hidden for a reason. The deeper they went, the more intense the vibrations became, the floor beneath their feet humming with energy. Max, who had been leading the way, suddenly stopped and turned around, looking at Jack and Edith with wide eyes. He barked once, sharp and insistent. "What is it, Max?" Jack asked, his heart pounding in his chest. The dog didn't answer, but his gaze shifted to the far end of the passage, where the tunnel seemed to open up into a larger chamber. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. A faint light, glowing from the heart of the chamber. It wasn't the same light they had seen outside, but it was just as strange. "Do you see that?" Edith whispered, her voice filled with awe. Jack nodded slowly. "I see it." They continued forward, Max still leading the way, his body tense and alert. As they neared the chamber, the light grew brighter, revealing a vast underground space. The chamber was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with more of the strange symbols. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it, a glowing crystal that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The air around the crystal shimmered, and Jack felt a powerful energy surge through his body, as though the very air was charged with something ancient and powerful. "This is it," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is what we've been looking for." Edith stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jack didn't answer at first. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary discovery. Whatever this crystal was, it held the answers they had been seeking. But as Jack stepped closer to the pedestal, the ground beneath them trembled again, stronger this time. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with the same energy as the crystal. Jack reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the pedestal, and then everything went dark. The darkness enveloped them as Jack's fingers brushed the pedestal, and the once glowing crystal flickered out, leaving the chamber in total blackness. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had stopped. The vibrations from the ground had ceased, and everything was still. Then, the low hum of energy that had been pulsing through the walls began to build again, but this time, it was different. The sound was louder, deeper, almost like a heartbeat. Jack stood frozen, his hands still on the pedestal, unsure of what had just happened. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on him. He turned his head toward Edith, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you feel that?" Edith nodded, her eyes wide in the darkness, barely visible in the dim light. "What is that sound?" "It's like the whole place is alive." Before Jack could answer, Max let out a sharp bark, his body tense, his fur bristling. The dog had never acted this way before. "What's wrong, boy?" Jack whispered, his voice strained. Max growled low in his throat, his gaze fixed on something ahead. Jack followed the dog's line of sight, but saw nothing. It was as if Max was sensing something they couldn't. Then, as suddenly as it started, the humming stopped. The air went eerily quiet. "What's going on?" Edith asked, her voice shaky now. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but he felt an overwhelming urge to move, to find out what was happening. "We need to leave," Jack said, his voice calm but urgent. "Something's not right." But before he could make another move, the crystal suddenly flared back to life. The light was blinding, almost as if it was calling them. It flickered wildly, brighter than it had ever been, illuminating the chamber with an otherworldly glow. Jack instinctively took a step back, his heart racing. "What is that?" Edith gasped, stepping closer to Jack. "Is it some kind of trap?" Jack shook his head, unable to look away from the crystal. "I don't know, but I think we need to see what happens." He reached out and touched the pedestal again. The moment his fingers made contact with the stone, the crystal's glow intensified, and the ground beneath them began to rumble. Max barked loudly, but it was as though the dog's voice was swallowed by the roar of the vibrations. The floor cracked open beneath their feet, and Jack instinctively grabbed Edith's arm, pulling her toward him. "Get back!" Jack shouted. But before they could retreat, the floor gave way, and the two of them were falling. The world spun, and all Jack could hear was the rush of wind and the sound of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, with a sudden jolt, they landed. Jack's body hit the ground hard, knocking the breath out of him. He gasped, struggling to sit up, his hands trembling as he pushed himself to his knees. Edith was beside him, equally shaken but unharmed. "What happened?" Edith asked, her voice hoarse. Jack looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. They were no longer in the chamber. Instead, they had fallen into a massive underground cavern. The walls of the cavern were lined with what appeared to be the same glowing symbols they had seen on the stones earlier. But this time, the symbols were moving, shifting, as though they had a life of their own. The cavern was enormous, stretching out in all directions, and at the center of it, something massive loomed. Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. It was a massive stone structure, a colossal door of sorts, covered in ancient markings and glowing with an eerie light. "Is this the temple?" Edith whispered, awe and fear in her voice. Jack didn't know what it was, but he knew that whatever it was something far beyond their understanding. "We need to go closer," Jack said, his voice low, determined. Edith hesitated but then nodded, following Jack as he moved toward the massive structure. Max stayed close, his senses on high alert, every muscle in his body taut. As they neared the stone door, Jack felt a strange pull, an undeniable force drawing him closer. He placed his hand on the stone, and the moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, making him stumble back. The ground beneath their feet shook, and the door began to open slowly, revealing a dark, swirling void beyond. "Jack," Edith whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that?" Jack didn't answer. He was too mesmerized by what was unfolding before them. The swirling void inside the door was like nothing he had ever seen. It was as if the air itself was alive, constantly shifting and changing, drawing them in. The moment the door opened fully, the void seemed to pulse, almost like a heartbeat, and a voice echoed through the chamber. It was low and rumbling, a voice that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. "You have found the key," the voice boomed, sending a chill down Jack's spine. "The time has come." Jack looked at Edith, his mind racing. What did this mean? What key? And who was speaking to them? The voice continued. "Only those who are chosen may enter. But be warned, the path you choose will alter the course of your destiny." Jack stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the words pressing heavily on him. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the unknown, knowing that whatever awaited them on the other side would change everything. Edith hesitated but followed Jack, and Max, ever faithful, trotted ahead, guiding them into the swirling darkness. As the door closed behind them, the chamber fell silent once more, leaving only the echo of their footsteps in the vast, unknown world ahead. The moment Jack crossed the threshold, the air around him seemed to shift. It felt thick, almost electric, and a deep sense of foreboding settled over him like a heavy weight. Edith followed closely behind, her steps hesitant, but Max, as always, pressed forward, undeterred by the strange energy that surrounded them. The swirling void they had stepped into was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The walls of the cavern were no longer solid stone but a strange, liquid-like surface, shimmering and shifting with every movement. The deeper they walked, the more it felt as though the world was bending around them, as if reality itself was being stretched and manipulated. Jack could feel the ground beneath his feet pulsing with a rhythm he could not explain, a steady beat that seemed to sync with his own heartbeat. It was both unsettling and oddly familiar, as though he had felt this sensation before, in a place far away and long ago. The voice from the door echoed in his mind, the words still ringing like a distant whisper. "Only those who are chosen may enter." What did it mean to be chosen? And how was he supposed to know if he was? Jack's thoughts were interrupted as the darkness ahead began to take shape. A faint light appeared in the distance, and as they moved closer, it revealed a massive stone structure at the center of the cavern. It was unlike the one they had seen before, more intricate, adorned with symbols and carvings that seemed to come to life in the light. The walls of the structure pulsed with energy, and Jack could feel the force radiating from it, pulling him forward. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to vibrate, and Jack felt an overwhelming sense of urgency building inside him. Max, who had been leading the way, suddenly stopped and let out a deep growl. Jack froze, instinctively reaching for Edith's arm. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered. Max's gaze was fixed on the entrance of the stone structure, his ears pinned back. Jack followed the dog's line of sight, his heart pounding in his chest. There, in the center of the entrance, was a large, ornate door. It was unlike anything Jack had ever seen. No handle, no visible means of entry. The door was a solid, glowing mass of stone, the same strange symbols covering its surface, pulsating with an eerie light. Jack stepped closer, his hand instinctively reaching for the door. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground trembled beneath them. Max barked sharply, pulling Jack back. "Jack!" Edith cried, her voice tight with fear. Jack turned to her, his eyes wide. "It's okay," he said, though his voice was shaky. "Something's happening. Stay back." But as he spoke, the door before them began to shift, the symbols on its surface twisting and rearranging in patterns Jack couldn't understand. The air around them grew colder, and a deep rumbling sound echoed through the cavern. Jack's pulse quickened as the door started to open, slowly at first, then faster, until it was wide enough for them to see what lay beyond. The darkness beyond the door was impenetrable, but Jack could feel something watching them from within. The atmosphere in the cavern grew thick with tension, and Jack felt as though the very air was alive, charged with energy. The voice echoed in his mind again, the words repeating with a new sense of urgency. The path you choose will alter the course of your destiny. He glanced at Edith, who was standing frozen, her face pale. "We have to go," Jack said, his voice tight with determination. He didn't know why, but he knew they had to enter. Edith hesitated, looking between Jack and the dark void ahead. "Jack, we don't know what's in there. We don't even know what this place is." "I know," Jack said, his hand resting on her shoulder. "But I feel like this is the only way. We've come this far. We can't turn back now." Edith nodded slowly, though Jack could see the doubt in her eyes. "All right, but we stick together." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the unknown. As soon as they entered, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the cavern. The air was thick with a strange energy, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Max, ever the protector, stayed close, his eyes alert, scanning their surroundings. Jack tried to steady his breathing as he looked around, but the darkness was suffocating. He couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow from the symbols that lined the walls. The passage ahead was narrow, the walls closing in on either side, and Jack could feel the vibrations beneath his feet growing stronger with every step. It was as if the entire space was alive, breathing with them. They moved deeper into the passage, the walls narrowing as they went. Jack's pulse quickened, but he refused to turn back. He had to know what lay ahead, what secrets were hidden within this place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into another chamber, this one much larger than the last. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, the same symbols that had appeared on the door, but now they seemed to glow with a brighter, more intense light. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, much like the one they had seen earlier. But this one was different. On it rested a large, crystal-like object, glowing with an inner light. Jack approached the pedestal slowly, his heart racing as he reached out to touch the crystal. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the entire chamber seemed to vibrate, and a voice echoed through the room, louder than before. "You have arrived." The voice was deep, resonant, and filled with an ancient power. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice filled with awe and fear. The voice responded, not with words, but with a surge of energy that coursed through Jack's body, filling him with a sense of both fear and understanding. "I am the guardian of this place. And you, Jack Miller, have been chosen." The moment the voice echoed through the chamber, Jack's heart skipped a beat. It was deep, powerful, and felt like it was coming from all around them, as if the very walls were speaking. He froze for a moment, trying to process what was happening. "Chosen," Jack whispered, barely able to form the words. "What does that mean?" Edith, standing beside him, seemed just as stunned. "Who are you?" she called out into the chamber, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was no answer, just the heavy silence of the cavern. Then, the voice responded, not through words, but through a surge of energy that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet, filling the air with an electric hum. Jack could feel it deep inside, in the marrow of his bones, a power that was ancient and alive. "You have found the crystal, and with it, you have awakened the path," the voice said, its tone both commanding and ancient. "The path," Jack repeated, his mind racing. What was this path, and why had it chosen him? "What do you want from us?" Edith's voice broke through the silence again, but this time, it was more urgent, more desperate. "We've been following the light, but we don't know what's going on. What is this place? What are you?" The voice seemed to pause, as if considering her question before responding. "I am the guardian of this place, of the ancient power that rests within these walls. The crystal you have touched is the key to unlocking a power that has been dormant for centuries." Jack stepped closer to the pedestal, his fingers still tingling from where they had touched the crystal. It felt as though the energy of the entire cavern was flowing through him now. "What do you mean, dormant?" Jack asked, trying to make sense of the situation. "What is this power?" "It is the power of the earth itself, the force that holds the balance of nature. The voice explained, its tone growing more intense. This place, this chamber, is where it was all sealed away long ago. You, Jack Miller, and your companion, Edith, are the ones who were meant to awaken it. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what he had just heard, but everything about the situation felt too real to ignore. The voice continued, as if it had no choice but to explain. The power within the crystal is tied to the very fabric of the world. It is the force that has kept the balance of life in check for millennia. But now, the time has come for it to be used once more. Used? For what? Edith interjected, her voice sharp. The voice grew colder, darker, as it answered. The world is in turmoil. The balance that has held it together is weakening, and the power within the crystal is needed to restore it. But this power comes with a cost. Jack took a step back, absorbing the weight of the words. A cost? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What kind of cost? The voice did not immediately respond, as if reluctant to reveal the full truth. When it spoke again, the words were filled with grave finality. The cost is sacrifice. The power that can restore the balance of the world must be wielded by those who are willing to pay the price. You have been chosen, but the path ahead is fraught with danger. Only those who are truly worthy will be able to wield this power without losing themselves in the process. Edith's face had gone pale as she listened, and Jack could see the fear in her eyes. He could feel the weight of the decision that lay before them. How do we know if we're worthy? Jack asked, his voice shaking. What if we're not? The voice seemed to pause for a moment before it responded, its tone almost sympathetic. The choice is not yours alone, Jack Miller. You and Edith must decide together. The power of the crystal will reveal what lies within you both. The question is, will you use it for good, or will the darkness within you take control? Jack felt a surge of panic rise within him. He had never asked for this, never wanted to be a part of something so immense. The weight of the world was suddenly pressing down on him, and the responsibility seemed too much to bear. But as he looked at Edith, he saw the same fear reflected in her eyes, the same uncertainty. We're in this together, Jack whispered to her, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. Edith nodded, her face set with determination. We have to be. We don't have a choice now. Jack turned back to the pedestal, his fingers hovering above the crystal once more. He could feel the energy in the air, a palpable force that seemed to be calling to him, urging him to make a decision. The room seemed to pulse around them, the markings on the walls glowing brighter, the symbols shifting and changing as if alive. What happens now? Jack asked, his voice hoarse. The voice responded, its tone somber. Now, the power is yours to claim. But be warned. Once you take the crystal, there is no turning back. The choice you make will determine the fate of the world. Jack took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew had to be done. This was no longer just about him or Edith. This was about something far greater, something that could change the course of history. I'll do it, Jack said, his voice unwavering. We'll do it. Edith stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. Together, they reached out and touched the crystal, feeling the surge of energy flow through them. The room erupted in light, blinding and powerful, and for a moment, everything went silent. When the light faded, the chamber was still once more, but the weight of the decision had already been made. They had chosen their path, and now they would face whatever lay ahead. The moment their hands made contact with the crystal, the world around Jack and Edith seemed to implode. It wasn't an explosion, but a sudden, overwhelming force that filled their bodies and minds, a jolt of power so intense that it stole their breath. For a brief moment, the chamber around them disappeared into blinding light, and they were suspended in nothingness. The air was thick with energy, and Jack felt as if his very soul was being pulled apart. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. The overwhelming pressure lifted, and Jack found himself standing in the same chamber, though everything felt different. The air was still, but there was a new presence in the room, something ancient and powerful, resonating from the crystal at the center of the pedestal. Jack took a cautious step back, breathing heavily, trying to steady his shaking hands. Edith was beside him, equally stunned, her eyes wide with disbelief. What just happened? She asked, her voice trembling. Jack could barely speak. his mind still reeling from the surge of energy that had coursed through him. I don't know, he replied, his voice hoarse. But I think we've done something. Something big. The crystal in the center of the pedestal now pulsed with a steady glow, brighter than before. It was no longer just a light. It was alive, vibrating with power. Jack couldn't take his eyes off it. It was as though it was calling to him, pulling him in, demanding his attention. What is it? Edith whispered, her voice barely audible. What have we unleashed? Jack turned toward her, his mind racing. I think we've awakened it. The power. The force that's been sealed away. But as he spoke, a sudden noise broke the tension. The sound of something moving, deep within the cavern. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Max, who had been standing quietly beside them, suddenly growled low, his body tense, his eyes darting toward the entrance of the chamber. What is it, boy? Jack asked, instinctively reaching for his companion's collar. Max's growl deepened, and his eyes locked onto something in the darkness beyond. Jack's pulse quickened. Whatever had been unleashed by touching the crystal was not the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. A dark shape slowly emerged from the shadows, moving toward them with a deliberate slowness. The figure was tall and cloaked, its face obscured in shadow. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he stepped back, instinctively pulling Edith closer. The figure stepped into the dim light of the chamber, revealing its form. It was humanoid, but there was something unnatural about it. Its eyes glowed faintly, like the symbols on the walls, and its movements were fluid, almost as if it were part of the cavern itself. Who are you? Jack demanded, trying to steady his voice. The figure didn't answer immediately. It stopped a few feet away from them, standing in the center of the chamber, as if assessing them. Jack's hand instinctively went to the small weapon he had kept with him, but the figure made no move toward them. Instead, it simply stood still, its glowing eyes locked onto his. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it spoke, its voice low and resonant, filling the chamber. You have awakened the Guardian, it said. Jack's stomach churned at the words. The Guardian? He repeated. What do you mean? The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the crystal. The crystal you have touched is not just a source of power. It is the key to the Guardian's release. You have broken the seal, and now it is free to return to its rightful place. Jack's heart raced. Return to its rightful place? He echoed. What does that mean? The figure tilted its head, as if considering him. The Guardian is the force that protects this world. For centuries, it has remained dormant, waiting for the one who would awaken it. You, Jack Miller, are that one. But know this. With the awakening comes great responsibility. The balance of the world is fragile, and your actions will determine the fate of all. Jack felt his head spin. He had only touched the crystal. He had done nothing else. And yet now he was responsible for the fate of the world? How could we be responsible for that? Edith asked, her voice breaking. The figure turned its gaze to her. You both are bound to the crystal now. You are the chosen keepers of its power. But the world is in peril. There are forces, ancient and powerful, that seek to control the crystal, to use its power for their own gain. If you fail in your task, the consequences will be dire. Jack stepped forward, his mind still reeling from the gravity of the situation. What exactly are we supposed to do? He asked. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, as if responding to his question. You must protect the crystal, keep it safe, and prevent those who seek to use it from doing so. But there is a price for every choice, and the path ahead will not be easy. Jack clenched his fists, trying to process everything he had just heard. Protect the crystal? Keep it safe? The weight of the task was suffocating, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for this responsibility. What happens if we fail? He asked. The figure's expression remained unreadable. The balance will be shattered. The world will fall into chaos, and everything you know will cease to exist as it does now. The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. The stakes were higher than anything he could have imagined. There was no turning back now. We'll do it, Edith said, her voice steady but filled with determination. Jack looked at her, seeing the resolve in her eyes. She wasn't backing down. Neither was he. We'll protect it, Jack said, his voice firm. The figure nodded, as if satisfied with their answer. Then your journey begins now, it said, and with a wave of its hand, the chamber began to shift around them. The walls faded into the darkness, and the light from the crystal flickered one last time before going out. The cavern was silent again, But Jack knew that what lay ahead was the true test of their strength, and the world's fate rested in their hands. The moment the light from the crystal faded, Jack felt the weight of the silence around him, pressing down like a physical force. The air was thick with uncertainty, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift slightly, as though the very fabric of reality had just been bent. Edith stood beside him, her face pale, but her expression determined. She didn't speak, but Jack could feel her thoughts racing, just as his own were. The figure, now seemingly absent, had left them with an impossible task: protect the crystal, keep it safe, and prevent the chaos that would follow if it fell into the wrong hands. But what did it all mean? And who exactly was this force that was threatening the world? Jack turned his attention back to the pedestal where the crystal had rested. It was gone now, leaving nothing but the faintest traces of its energy in the air. But Jack could still feel its power, humming softly within the depths of the cavern. He reached out, instinctively placing his hand on the stone, hoping for some sign, some answer. But nothing came. What now? Edith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't have an answer. The weight of the decision they had just made was settling over him, heavy and suffocating. They had taken the crystal's power, and now they were bound to it. I don't know, Jack finally admitted, his voice rough. But I think we need to get out of here. There's nothing left for us in this chamber. Whatever happens next, it's going to happen out there. Edith nodded, but she didn't move. You're right. But what are we supposed to do? The crystal is gone. What's left for us to protect? Jack paused, thinking. He didn't have all the answers, but there was one thing he was sure of. The world was in danger, and they were the only ones who could stop it. We find out what's out there, he said, his voice steady now, filled with purpose. We have to stop whoever is trying to take control of the crystal. We have to make sure that power doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Max, who had been standing silently at their side, suddenly stepped forward, his nose twitching. The dog seemed to sense something, his ears erect and his tail held high. Jack looked at him and then turned to Edith. He's right. Whatever this is, it's not over. We have to keep moving. Together, they turned toward the exit of the chamber, Max leading the way. The walls of the cavern seemed to pulse with energy as they walked, and Jack could still feel the strange hum in the air. It wasn't just the crystal. It was something deeper, something older. As they emerged from the cavern, the outside world greeted them with a stark contrast to the underground world they had just left. The night was clear, the sky filled with countless stars, but there was an unsettling stillness in the air. The storm from earlier had passed, but something felt wrong. The landscape around them seemed eerily quiet, too quiet. It's like the world is holding its breath, Edith said, her voice barely audible in the stillness. Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Something's coming. I can feel it. They walked cautiously, Max in the lead, his senses on high alert. The path they followed wound through dense trees, the moonlight filtering through the branches, casting long shadows on the ground. It wasn't long before they came to a clearing, and there, in the distance, they saw it. A figure standing motionless under the moonlight, its silhouette outlined against the trees. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, but there was something unmistakable about the way it stood. It was waiting for them. Who was that? Edith asked, her voice tight with fear. Jack's instincts screamed at him to move, to protect Edith, but something about the figure felt strangely familiar. I don't know, Jack said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. But we need to find out. They moved forward, cautiously, Max growling low as they approached the figure. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge their presence. Jack's hand rested on the hilt of his weapon, his every sense on high alert. When they were only a few feet away, the figure finally spoke, its voice deep and resonant, sending a chill through Jack's spine. You have awakened the power, it said, its voice like a whisper on the wind. And now you must face the consequences of your actions. Jack froze, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this. Who are you? Jack demanded. What do you want from us? The figure stepped forward, its face still obscured in shadow. I am the one who was sent to ensure that the crystal's power does not fall into the wrong hands. And you, Jack Miller, have made a grave mistake. Jack's breath caught in his throat. A mistake? We're trying to stop whoever is after the crystal. The crystal is only a piece of a much larger puzzle. the figure replied, its voice growing colder. And you, Jack, have just unlocked the final piece. Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What do you mean? The power that was sealed away is not just a force of nature. It is the key to a new world, a world where the balance you know will be shattered. And you are the one who has opened the door. The figure's words hit Jack like a blow, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. You're saying we've doomed the world? Edith asked, her voice filled with disbelief. The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, it turned away and began walking toward the trees, its movements deliberate. You'll soon see the truth. The question now is whether you'll be able to survive what comes next. Jack's heart raced. This was far from over. The true danger had just begun. As the figure disappeared into the shadows, Jack's mind was reeling. The words of the cloaked figure echoed in his ears. You've unlocked the final piece. What did that mean? What had they really unleashed by touching the crystal? Jack looked at Edith, who was standing frozen beside him, her face pale but her eyes sharp, searching the woods for any signs of danger. We can't let this go, Jack said, his voice tight. We have to find out what the final piece means, what it is that we've really done. Edith nodded slowly, her gaze flicking between Jack and the dark forest that seemed to press in on them. But we're in way over our heads, Jack. This feels like more than we can handle. Jack knew she was right. Every step they had taken so far had led them deeper into a world they never imagined existed, a world filled with powers and secrets far beyond their understanding. But they couldn't. Stop now. They had come too far. We don't have a choice, Jack said firmly. We have to stop whoever is after the crystal, and we have to understand what the Guardian meant. The world is at stake. Max, who had been standing silently at their side, suddenly moved, his body tense, his ears perked. He looked toward the dark path ahead, his eyes alert and focused. Let's move, Jack said, his voice steady despite the weight of what lay ahead. They started walking, Max leading the way. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jack could feel it too. There was an oppressive stillness in the air, thick with tension. As they moved deeper into the forest, the trees began to thin, and the ground beneath their feet grew uneven. The deeper they went, the more Jack felt like they were being watched, as if the forest itself had eyes. Edith walked beside him, her eyes darting nervously from side to side, every crack of a twig or rustling of leaves making her flinch. Jack, do you hear that? Edith asked in a low voice, her words barely audible in the quiet. Jack stopped and listened. At first, he didn't hear anything. But then, in the distance, he heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper, like something moving through the trees. It was almost too quiet to be sure of, but it was there. We're not alone, Jack murmured. Edith looked around, her eyes wide with fear. What do we do? Jack didn't have an answer. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to run. But he knew they couldn't. They had to push forward, no matter what was lurking in the woods. They continued walking, now more cautiously, the sound of something, or someone, following them just out of reach. Max, who had been walking ahead, stopped abruptly. The dog's body was tense, his nose in the air, sniffing, his growl low and constant. What is it, Max? Jack whispered. Max's growl deepened, his eyes narrowed, focused on something ahead. Jack's heart raced as he followed Max's gaze. And then he saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, there was a figure. It was tall, cloaked, and standing completely still. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. We're being followed, he said, his voice tight with fear. Edith's eyes widened. Who is that? She whispered, barely able to speak. Jack didn't answer. He didn't know who it was, but he had a feeling that it was someone, or something, that was connected to the power they had awakened. The figure stood motionless, not moving, not acknowledging them at all. Jack's instincts screamed at him to approach with caution, but the figure didn't move. He felt a strange sense of familiarity, though. We need to find out who that is, Jack said, his voice low. Max, as if understanding the urgency, began to move forward, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the figure. Jack and Edith followed, their steps silent in the underbrush. The closer they got, the more the figure seemed to loom over them. The darkness seemed to swirl around it, but Jack could make out the faint outline of a face beneath the hood. It was no longer just a silhouette. The figure slowly turned to face them. The light from the moon illuminated its features, and Jack froze in his tracks. It was a face he recognized. It was Mason, the same Mason who had led them to the chamber beneath the earth, the one who had warned them about the power they were unleashing. But now, his face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if something was deeply wrong. "Mason?" Jack asked, his voice tentative. The figure didn't answer at first. It stood there, as if weighing something, before finally speaking. "You shouldn't have come," Mason said, his voice eerily distant. "You've awakened something that cannot be undone. The crystal was never meant to be disturbed." "Mason, what's happened to you?" Edith asked, her voice filled with concern. The figure's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Jack saw a flash of something human behind them. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by an emptiness that made Jack's skin crawl. "I'm sorry," Mason whispered, his voice barely audible. "But you've made a grave mistake. The power you've unleashed is beyond anything you can control. It will consume you, just as it has consumed me." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't the Mason they had known. The person standing before them was a shadow, something twisted by the very power they had awakened. Jack's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "What do we do now?" Edith whispered, fear seeping into her voice. Jack turned to her, his resolve hardening. "We stop him, and we stop whatever he's become." The figure took a step forward, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "It's too late," he said, his voice hollow. "There is no stopping it now." As Mason took another step forward, his once familiar face now twisted with something Jack could not fully comprehend, the weight of the situation settled heavily upon them. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, his expression empty and cold. Jack's heart raced, but he refused to show fear. They had come too far, and now was not the time to back down. Edith's grip tightened on his arm, her breath shallow as she too faced the man they once knew. The world around them was still. The forest stood silent, almost waiting, as the power they had awakened shifted the balance. Jack looked at Mason, trying to see any trace of the person he once was, but there was nothing left. It was as if the crystal, the energy, had drained the humanity from him, leaving only an empty vessel. "Mason," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow, "this isn't you. You can fight this. We can still fix this." The figure, or whatever Mason had become, let out a bitter laugh, its sound echoing through the trees. "It's too late for that," Mason said, his voice colder than Jack had ever heard. "The path you've chosen cannot be undone. The crystal was never meant to be disturbed. Now, it is too late to stop what is coming." Jack's stomach tightened with a sense of dread he could not shake. "What's coming?" Edith demanded, her voice strained. Mason's face twitched, his lips curling into something like a twisted smile. "The return of the true guardian. The one who will claim the power for himself. You've awakened what should have remained hidden, and now he is coming to take what is his." Jack and Edith exchanged a look, their minds racing. They had no idea what Mason was talking about, but it was clear that whatever it was far worse than they had imagined. The air around them seemed to thicken, a presence now hanging heavily in the space, like something was watching them, waiting for them to make their next move. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and a distant rumble echoed through the trees. Jack looked around, trying to make sense of the shifting atmosphere. "We can't let this happen," Jack said, his voice low but resolute. "We have to stop him before he reaches the crystal. We have to stop whatever is coming." But before they could act, the rumble grew louder, and the ground shook beneath them. The trees around them groaned, their trunks twisting as if something below was forcing its way up. Jack barely had time to react before the earth cracked open, and from the depths of the cavern emerged a dark, swirling figure, towering over them. It was like nothing Jack had ever seen before. The figure was cloaked in shadows, its body made of an eerie, shifting smoke-like substance that seemed to bend the light around it. Its eyes burned with an intense red glow, and its voice, when it spoke, was like the thunder, deep and thunderous, shaking the very air around them. "You have awakened me," the figure said, its voice filling the forest like a storm. "Now, you will serve my will, or be destroyed." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was the true guardian, the one Mason had spoken of. It was a being of immense power, one that had been hidden away for centuries, waiting for the right moment to return. "No," Jack shouted, stepping forward, his voice defiant. "We will stop you." The figure's laughter rumbled through the air, low and menacing. "You cannot stop what has already been set into motion," it said, its voice reverberating with dark power. "The crystal's power is mine to command, and you are nothing but pawns in a game you cannot understand." Edith stepped forward, her voice sharp with determination. "We won't let you have it. We won't let you control everything." The figure's red eyes narrowed, its form swirling with dark energy. "You cannot stop me," it hissed, its form growing larger, looming over them like an unstoppable force. "You will bow before me, or you will perish." Jack clenched his fists, refusing to back down. He wasn't going to let this creature destroy everything they had fought for. They had to find a way to stop it. Suddenly, Max, who had been standing at Jack's side, let out a low growl, his eyes locked on the figure. The dog's growl turned into a fierce bark, and before Jack could stop him, Max charged at the figure, his body a blur of motion. The figure hissed, its red eyes narrowing as Max closed the distance. With a wave of its hand, the figure sent a blast of dark energy toward the dog, knocking him back. Jack's heart stopped in his chest as he watched Max slam into the ground, the force of the blast sending a shockwave through the clearing. "Max!" Jack screamed, rushing toward his dog. But Max, though clearly injured, slowly got to his feet, his eyes still locked on the figure. The dog was hurt, but he wasn't backing down. Jack looked at Edith, his mind racing. They had no weapons, no real plan, and no idea how to stop the force that had risen from the depths. But one thing was certain, they couldn't let it win. "We can't fight it directly," Jack said, his voice filled with urgency. "But maybe we can disrupt its power. Maybe the crystal is the key." Edith nodded, understanding what Jack was suggesting. They had to destroy the very thing that had awakened this dark force. The crystal was the source of its power. Jack turned back to the figure, his voice filled with defiance. "You won't have it," he said, stepping between the creature and the crystal. "Not if we can stop you first." The figure's eyes burned with fury. "You are nothing. You cannot defeat me," it snarled, its form swirling with dark energy. But Jack knew what he had to do. He looked at Edith, and together, they stepped toward the pedestal, ready to face whatever came next.